Hello friends, this is Odds, as we discussed in our previous therapy session, and today I am doing something that is very simple, very straightforward, but that many of you have requested. It is the lore accurate build for every killer. We already did this for Survivor, there's only a couple missing since they came out, where we go over every character and we give them 4 perks that fit the narrative. Be it their original film or TV show that they're from, be it their archives, be it their backstory, anything and everything I could get my hands on. I've studied, I've watched the cutscenes, I've read the lore, I've also consulted with you guys, and I had Pixel Bush, who is a very avid lore appreciator. I'll let his channel be linked in the description and I'll also give him a shout out at the end. Help me out, and between all of that, I put together 26 builds, 1 for each killer. I've also tried to not use their own perks on themselves too much, and we are making every killer have 4 perks, so a few of them had to be repeated to fill the empty spots. And I've also given every killer the most lore accurate look, the most accurate outfit and cosmetic that I could find to what they should have looked like more realistically during their story. So with that out of the way, I think I've said everything important. Timestamps in the description, of course. None of these builds are really great for gameplay, but yeah, here we go. We're gonna start with Trapper. So Trapper, also known as Evan, has the following 4 perks, and the first one is Whispers. Now, obviously, Trapper being the original killer is connected to the entity, but more so than other killers, Trapper has listened to the whispers of somebody else. If you are not aware, the Trapper kind of went insane and began to listen and adore his father, who was a big tycoon who owned several mines. And he started to do his bidding and listen to everything he did and enforce his will, hence the Whispers. He's also a territorial character, so this makes sense from a gameplay perspective as well. The next one is Oppression. If you read his lore, you see that when he was young, the Trapper, Evan, was a bit of a bleeding heart. He cared about his workers, he wanted to secure their rights, he wanted to give them a better environment. But at some point, he started to see all of them as potential backstabbers, and he started to adore his father, who by all means was a horrible oppressor who used his position of power to literally stomp on those below him, who he perceived as nothing more than worms. Hence, Oppression. Pocos the Weasel is a bit of an interesting one. Thematically, the perk doesn't fit the Trapper, but if we look at the lore, it does make a lot of sense because a deep bond with the entity, with his father, is what made Evan what he is, and definitely gave him strength. Now, Evan is a normal man, he's a miner, he obviously is very strong, but his supernatural strength comes from such a bond, hence the perk pop. And next is Claustrophobia, a perk that I think fits Evan very well because one of the first things he did, or perhaps the last thing he ever did before being taken by the entity, was to murder hundreds and hundreds of his own workers by trapping them in mines and blowing up the entrances and literally suffocating them to death in such a horrible way to pass. Now, if you've been in a mine, and I have, you'll see that the feeling of claustrophobia without even being stuck on it is incredibly high. So I think this ties up Evan quite alright. Next up is Wraith, and I've actually gone a little bit out of my way to capture everything about this character, and some of these picks are a little bit odd. The first one is a bit of a stretch, but I personally like it, is Sanctioned Tactics. This is a character, this is a perk that is all about being aware of the battlefield. And if you don't know, the Wraith is actually one of the only characters in the game, especially on the killer side, that has been to a war. He was probably, most likely, part of the Nigerian Civil War or something, or another conflict along those lines as a child. Not really as a combatant, but rather as a victim of the war around him. He basically lost everything in war, and we can also infer that it was not only as a child, but also through part of his adulthood. And even as a kid, he was able to sneak up on a camp of assaulters, of looters and murdering guerrilla units, and actually burn them all to death to avenge his lost family. So I imagine that as an adult, Philip, that's the Wraith's name, should have at least some awareness of what war is like and how to maneuver around a battlefield. The next one is Gearhead. And this is an interesting one, perhaps during his time during the war, or perhaps only entirely when he moved to North America. Philip became a really good mechanic, and if you read his lore, you'll see that one of the things he was really, really good at was repairing cars and dealing with all the machinery. So Gearhead, I think, is appropriate. Funnily enough, despite his experience, he did not realize that he was doing the bidding of Azrob, his boss, and he was unknowingly murdering people in his work when he crushed cars. All of those cars contained corpses of people that were murdered by some of the shady businesses his boss was involved with. So seeing the juxtaposition of gear and bone, I think that's also very appropriate. Next up is Third Seal and Blood Warden. Now you'll see that because of his background and because of his enchantments, most of Philip's add-ons revolve around mud, blood, that kind of wizardry. One of them makes called the Blind Warrior, makes people not able to see. One of them called Blood. Many of his add-ons are drawn in blood, so it seems like he would be the one killer that can control the perception of survivors and take it away from them, and that can summon that kind of dark force to literally block the exit and make sure that no one gets away the same way his boss didn't get away and ended up being murdered. Next up is Hillbilly. Now, the first one is very, very simple. If you didn't know, the Hillbilly, despite being a basically deformed child, kept in a dark room by his parents and bullied in every single way imaginable, actually grew up to be freakishly large and freakishly strong. I believe in one of the tome entries, he literally lifts his mother with one hand and then crushes her when she refuses to tell him what his name really is. So he is very, very, very strong, and of course eventually broke out of his shackles. So brutal strength definitely fits him. Nemesis, if we read the description of the first line, also makes a lot of sense. Not only did his mom and his dad bully him, he actually had a bunch of people in the circle of his corrupt parents come in and make fun of him, and they all basically paraded him around to do horrible things for the entertainment of his parents' social circle. He absolutely hated these people, and the moment he got out, and the moment he gained agency over his own freedom, he absolutely destroyed and sought retribution on those people in very, very brutal ways. One of the more interesting things is that no one ever found out what happened, because the Hillbilly managed to kill everyone without really letting them escape, and none of them could ask for help, and one by one he eventually killed everyone in his family as well as some outsiders. And they never really managed to get out or communicate with the outside world what was happening. So everything was kept under wraps. So I think Knockout here is appropriate. Sloppy Butcher is also very appropriate. In a very literal sense, the Hillbilly took out his frustration not only on people but also on the animals on the farm. And he did so with extreme violence. In fact, they were encouraged. He was encouraged to do that by his parents. As some kind of sick show. So again, it's very, very appropriate. He also completely dismembered and disemboweled one of the police officers that made fun of him. Seems like an appropriate one for a very, very literal reason. Next up is the nurse. Some of them make a lot of sense. She was, well, we'll get to that, I suppose. Nurse's Calling, I think, even though it is her own perk, it makes a lot of sense. She did have a very, very strong duty to take care of her patients. Eventually, because of the nature of her patients and the absolute horrible things that she witnessed, this drove her absolutely insane. And she eventually suffocated people and put them out of their misery. And there is a big theme of grasp, of breath, and how she took the breath away from all of her patients. That's why Stratter, even though, again, it's her own perk, makes a lot of sense. Bitter Murmur is also appropriate. Not only does it make sense, from a gameplay point of view. It also makes sense that she would be related to a perk that is all about breath and talking and absolutely being bitter. And another one that I think is appropriate is Blood Echo, which states that the agony of one is inflicted on others. When she felt that she was at her tipping point, she absolutely lost control, and she had this eugenics state of mind where she thought it's just best to kill everyone, put them out of their misery. So her own suffering, she passed on to everyone else, and eventually, you know, murder her own patients, perhaps even more than that. So that's where the build for Nurse comes from, even though many other perks would honestly also suit her really well. Next up is Huntress. Her own perk, Hunter's Lullaby, makes perfect sense. We have given her clothes that are a little bit more winter friendly. Anna grew up basically alone after her mother died. Her mother was a huntress and would take care of herself, but eventually she died in a hunting accident, and she was left alone, and she was basically a child in the body of an adult eventually, completely unable to function in society, simply hunting animals, hunting people, and taking care of herself. She did learn the lullaby song from her mother, and she probably is the only killer that makes sense would sing in her normal daily duties. Deerstalker, obviously, despite being a common perk, suits her best. She is the one character that is actually a hunter of deers, that would know how to hunt prey, because she knew her surroundings extremely well. Territorial Imperative, her own perk, also seems appropriate, even though many other perks would serve. She defended her own home. When troops from armies came in, they would vanish and disappear. Just because she knew the terrain so well, despite not having weaponry or even basic understanding of technology, she would be able to kill them one by one. Another interesting thing about the Hunters is that she collected many things from her prey. If you have a look at her add-ons, you'll realize that there's a lot of little soldier memorabilia, soldier accessories, soldier belts, and also many little toys. The Hunters tried to be a mother, the only figure she's ever had, to little children that she would kidnap. But she didn't understand that children had to eat, and eventually the children would die. All she thought she needed to do was to keep toys and little trinkets to make the children happy, but unfortunately this was a completely misguided way to take care of them, and every child and little girl that she would keep would eventually starve to death and die. So seeing that she does this, I think Hoarder is also really appropriate for her. Next up is Michael. Now, the perk Monitor Abuse is almost made for him. Michael, after escaping from the mental hospital he was committed to for having killed his sister years prior, was a hollow husk of a person, completely impossible to ascertain his motives. Instead, he was just bent on just killing for some unknown reason. And the way he did that was definitely by monitoring and abuse. He would stalk people. He would calmly walk around places and stare at them. And when he struck, he would struck really hard. He would go in, stab someone, kill them. I think this perk is really appropriate. Thanophobia, I think, is also appropriate, considering the state of mind of his victims in most of the movies that he is in. Especially even if we just consider the first one. You will see that Laurie, the final girl of Halloween, literally breaks down and starts seeing him as a supernatural boogeyman once she realizes that her friends are dying one by one. So he does seem to have that effect where people eventually come face to face with the inevitability of what's about to happen. So Thanophobia seems appropriate. If you've watched any of the films, I'm sure you also agree that Overwhelming Presence is appropriate. Despite being a regular man, he's freakishly large stature, he's freakishly inexplicable strength and calmness does make people freak the hell out. And you will see that Laurie herself and many other people, despite perhaps being in a good place to run away, just crumble under their fears and move and act incredibly inefficiently. That's what sometimes gives him an upper hand. And another perk that seems quite appropriate, especially if you consider some of the sequels on the many timelines of Halloween, is Remember Me. Despite being just one man that killed a handful of people many years ago, the actions of Michael Myers echo in the town of Haddonfield and definitely have a lasting effect on his victims, most notably, of course, Laurie Strode. So, for one reason or another, depending on the continuity that you watch, Michael definitely makes people remember him, as he remembers them. So, that's it for Michael, even though many perks would also suit him. Next up is the Hag. Now, the Hag was a little child that got abducted by a cannibalistic cult. She was basically imprisoned in a horrible, dark basement where she was eaten alive, where people were being eaten alive. But she alone seemed to be able to transcend that horrible situation, and through the power of sheer will to live and take revenge, she ended up escaping and becoming a extremely cursed creature. So we made her full of blood, as she should be, and we have a theme going on. All of her perks are hexes to connect her with her wizardry hex related background, and all of them except for one are rooting their power on hope. So no one escapes death, Thrill the Hunt, and Devour Hope. All of them are hexes rooting their power on hope, as you can see in the description. And all of them obviously signify her only wish to escape her captors. And then we have a final hex perk, Retribution, and her obvious wish to get back at them, which she eventually did. So that's very simple for Hag. There could have been many other perks that would suit her, but that's eventually the ones I settled for. Doctor was a lot more interesting. The first one we decided was Plaything. Despite Doctor having a charade of intellectual pursuits and working for the government, eventually the Doctor developed his own depraved, absolutely cruel experiments that crossed the line of science into absolute evil things. So he absolutely toyed with his victims and reveled in their suffering and encouraged this suffering in many twisted ways. As someone that experimented with themselves and eventually managed to, with the help of the entity, control lightning and electricity, the perks Overcharge and Jolt, both are appropriate and pretty much a necessity for him. And then we have the final perk Surveillance, which is all about controlling your prey and seeing what they do and making sure they don't get away. I think this fits Doctor even better than the pig, who it comes from, because the Doctor not only monitor his victims, he is actually perhaps the character that has most gone out of their way to document everything. All of his experiments, all of his findings, all of his twisted little games, he would record in very detailed reports. And if you check through his add-ons, most of his add-ons are actually his reports of his findings. All of them obviously being cruel and messed up in some way. Eventually, he strayed away from his work on the government and started doing his own things, and went completely rogue. And I think this build represents that rather well. Next up is the Cannibal from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films. Barbecue and chili, being able to see people from afar while you defend something. Obviously, the fact that his family made food and having a deep bond with the entity to obviously signify his deep bond with his family. It's his own perk. I think it suits him quite well. A Monster Shrine is a perk that could fit many characters such as the Hag, but I think it goes particularly well with him. He is the one character that has one area, one little haven that he considers sacred, where everything happens. If you've seen the movies, you know that the Cannibal brings victims into his basement where he cuts their head off, their face off to wear as his own, as some kind of weird ritualistic game for him. This is also the place where he cuts those people to bits and feeds them later to his family, with whom he cannot really survive. Because he needs to grab people and bring them here, he has a ridiculously freakish strength, and people don't typically get away from him very much, hence Iron Grasp being our perk of choice for our third perk. And then Magritte also suits him quite well. If you're not aware, the Cannibal has some kind of condition. Perhaps it's his upbringing, perhaps it's something innate to his birth that doesn't make him capable of speaking. At least if he does, he certainly doesn't show it. He does seem to have some kind of condition that has been that might have been further exacerbated by the fact that his family is just absolutely insane. And then you will see many times he goes into tantrums, he becomes enraged, and he does all, especially in the original films, and he does all of these really crazy dances and displays of almost childlike behavior. Hence Magritte being the final perk for the Cannibal, even though again, many other perks could have really suited him. Next up is Freddy. Now, depending on whether you watch the original or the remake, this character is based on the remake, things change a little bit, but basically what you need to know is that Freddy holds a grudge. A grudge so strong that once he was dead, he literally lingered on as a spirit and tortured those that had wronged him. Now, his grudge was against the parents that had found out that he was abusing their children, and in a mob-like situation had burnt him to death. And this grudge was so strong that it eventually carried on to the children of those parents, and that's where the movie begins. Now, if you watch the movie, you know that Freddy doesn't attack directly as a spirit, as a ghost of sorts. He actually inhabits the dream world and attacks people while they sleep. And our next perk, Fearmonger, captures that beautifully. Your distressing presence drains and weakens your prey. This, the fact that Freddy appears in the dreams of people makes the people extremely weak, as they cannot sleep for fear of facing Freddy. And this makes many characters, the children of the parents who murder him, slowly go absolutely insane and go crazy and do not sleep, and obviously deal with all the consequences of the lack of sleep. And you can see that very well in Quentin Smith, but also many of the other characters. When these characters begin to die little by little, the other ones begin to rally and realize that something is wrong, and obviously become absolutely terrified. Freddy is very much obsessed with one of these kids in particular, and slowly makes sure to kill the other ones one by one, as well as saving the best for last. Now, despite having a grudge against all of these kids, there's one of them who Freddy seemed to be particularly fond of, and that was Nancy. And he does seem to make sure to leave her for last because of his extremely messed up obsession with this little child that he abused. So that I think makes perfect sense. That save the best for last would be a perk that would suit Freddy with this story. Again, many other perks would as well. Next up is the pig, and so many great ones. Deadman Switch is perhaps one of the best examples of how the pigs and overall Jigsaw's traps work. You force difficult decisions, and you make people really show their true colors and make them have to choose between one outcome or another, and get punished if they choose wrong. So with Deadman Switch, when a survivor is being punished or by being on the hook, the other ones must not let go of the generators. And if they do, these generators will become blocked. And this, to me, spells very basic Jigsaw trap behavior. Now, if you don't know, Amanda the pig is a woman who is a disciple to Jigsaw. Jigsaw is basically a serial killer that kidnaps people and puts them in these traps, these contraptions, these little escape rooms where they need to make horrible decisions, typically dealing with hurting themselves or taking some kind of punishment for their stupid life decisions and their horrible traits to make up for it. And if they pass these tests, these traps, they sometimes have a chance to live and escape and rebuild their life. Sometimes, however, these are not so fair. Amanda herself passed one of these tests and was incredibly grateful for her chance to have another go at life, and she developed a dark devotion towards Jigsaw, who later contacted her and took her under his wing. So dark devotion, I think, absolutely fits Amanda. She does have a dark devotion towards Jigsaw, and dark devotion also has the gameplay effect of reducing your own terror radius, which masks your presence, and even giving it to someone else. And that's something that Amanda very much did. Amanda and Jigsaw constantly tried to gaslight the police and gaslight their own victims into making them suspect each other, into making them think that someone else was the danger, while the danger actually lurked very, very close. Trail of Torment also seems appropriate. Not only is there a bunch of barbed wire on this perk, which is a classic element of Jigsaw traps, it does have a lot of things going for it as well that go well with Amanda. You guide your victims along the path of pain and punishment. Very appropriate. This perk also makes Amanda stealthy, or any killer stealthy that uses it, which again is appropriate because many times you know that Amanda hit her connection to Jigsaw and actually even was very close to their victims without them realizing that she was in on the game. And then the final perk could be nothing other than No Way Out. Amanda literally shuts the door to people that have failed the test and lets them rot and die. Obviously, until a test is over, no one is allowed to leave. This, I think, is just a very appropriate Jigsaw theme perk. No need more explanation than that. Next up is the Clown. Now, if you don't know, the Clown was basically a troubled kid who developed this obsession with collecting things. First, he collected feathers of birds, but eventually he grew to really get twisted obsessions, most of them revolving around collecting fingers of people and killing them, torturing them in very sick, twisted ways. His lifestyle of murder and hedonism was possible because he joined a itinerant circus, and that's where most of his story happens. Agitation is very, very appropriate. Unlike other killers, the Clown doesn't kill out of necessity, or doesn't kill out of a desire to kill itself. It's more the thrill that really moves him. If you read his lore, you'll know that he gets absolutely delighted at the idea of looking at fingers and thinking which one would suit his collection best. And he really is all about not just the killing as a means, but rather the process of obtaining his fingers that really excites him. All while doing this, he is keeping a facade of being a friendly old man, a friendly circus clown that nobody suspects, hence insidious. He also doesn't reveal his true motives even to people around him. When he has a disagreement with one of his fellow circus members, he literally messes with his equipment, which makes him fall to his death. But all of that switches very, very quickly when he uses his chemicals and kidnaps his prey, and then he is face to face with them on by himself. At that point, the facade drops and he becomes the monster that he really is. Fear of clowns, coulrophobia, his terrible, scary presence. I think this perk has to be on him. And then we also have Furtive Chase, which goes back to the idea of agitation, how he becomes obsessed with certain people due to traits that he himself seems to value. This very obsessed idea that their fingers are valuable and that he needs to collect them. And he does get them one by one while stalking them from a distance and lurking in the shadows, of course. So all of these perks, all in all, I think explain the Clown quite well. Next up is the Spirit. The Spirit is also a rancorous beast. She is murdered by her absolutely deranged father after he has some kind of mental breakdown. And as she is being murdered, her rage actually completely overflows. And when the entity was about to take her father to turn him into one of the killers, the entity actually changed its mind and decided to take her because her potential to be a killer was so much higher. Her rage completely, unbridled. One of the things that makes her rage so strong is her lineage. She comes from the Yamaoka family. We'll get to the Oni. And this Yamaoka family has a history of basically a curse, a horrible rage that burns within. Haunted Ground, I think, is appropriate. She lived in this Yamaoka state. One of the reasons her father was absolutely insane is because of the debt and the pressure that he was under. And one of the reasons why is because they lived in a Yamaoka state that was super huge and could not financially be sustainable. Her refusal to die until she could exact revenge, I think, is also exemplified really well in Undying. These two perks lash out, these two perks fight on and rage on, and I think they are appropriate. They're also hexes, which I think fit her theme. And then we have Forced Penance. Now the spirit herself has no grudge against the survivors and against other people, but the entity takes advantage of her absolute need to kill her father and take revenge for what he did by promising her that she will get to her father if she does the entity's bidding first. And that's what the whole spirit thing is about. She is seeking revenge towards her father, and anybody that gets in her way is gonna get caught up. Not because she has a grudge against them, but rather because she needs to get to her father. Hence, the Forced Penance choice. Next up is the Legion. The Legion are a group of 4 kids, so we're trying to get the perks that suit them all better. One of them, the main member of the Legion, is Frank. Frank is basically a newcomer to a Canadian town, a slightly older kid who is a bit of an edgy boy who has had a troubled childhood. And this boy finds out that Julie, Susie, and Joey are all very keen on listening to him, and they all fall under his influence. They all develop a dark devotion, if you will, towards Frank, who clearly pushes the limits time and time again, and eventually gets them to do, oh, we had an offline sub, forgive me. Eventually gets them to partake in all kinds of vandalism, and even later, worse things. Unrelenting, I think, is appropriate. Unlike some of the other characters in this roster, the Legion are not murderers. They're not warriors. They're not beasts or anything like that. They're just kids who are clumsy, who are not seasoned in the art of killing, and the only thing they have going for them is their numbers and their primal rage and their frenzy, which is basically all of their power. So they would miss hits more than other killers. They would have to make up for that with more hits. Their ability to hit in numbers, I think, would make Unrelenting a good pick for them. One of the things that they started doing very early in their criminal career was to steal items. You see, if you read the description of certain items, that even the shy girl Susie stabbed someone in the back to steal an item that she saw in a shop that she liked. This would eventually become a trend, and many items they would collect by literally hitting people. So I think Franklin's is very appropriate. And perhaps the most important perk of them all is Coup de Grace. I mean, they are Canadian, so they would speak French, I suppose, but that has nothing to do why I chose this perk. As I said, the Legion members were small-time criminals who eventually did bigger and bigger crime, but they were never killers. They were never murderers. Until one day, as fate would have it, they came across a man who was cleaning a store, who grabbed one of them, and then Frank absolutely lost it. He stabbed the man, and seeing that he was half dead, he urged everyone else to finish the job. So even though Legion members do not start out as killers, when push comes to shove, they actually become killers. And as the end nears, they definitely go in for the kill. And that's obviously also what happens when they are brought to the entity realm. And that's it for Legion. Next up is Plague, and Plague is a little bit difficult. She is not necessarily a killer or an evil figure. She is a priestess who is in a really difficult situation. She becomes adored by her people, but then becomes unable to protect them from a disease that spreads. She is all about worshipping a higher power, so we have perks such as Corrupt Intervention, her own perk, and Grim Embrace, both of which basically reward the servitude, reward the worshipping of a higher power by manifesting the entity. Another perk that manifests the entity is Hex Blood Favor, which will make the entity block the possible points of escape for survivors. And this one is interesting because the Plague might be the only killer that sacrificed herself for other people, both figuratively, literally, and also in a small token of her faith. Because when a person that was sick came to her temple, one of the things that made people look up to her was the fact that she was willing to sacrifice. She embraced this person and cut off her own toe as an offering, which you can find as one of her add-ons, by the way. So she was willing to spill blood to gain the favor of the gods. Of course, this eventually absolutely backfired and everyone got infected, and she became an itinerant preacher, and the entity took her. Because of her willingness to pray, to listen to the entity, and her connection to it, I think we will repeat the perk Whispers for Plague. In fact, she also whispers herself when she becomes powered up. So I think it is an appropriate perk for her. Although I really want to know what you guys would have picked for her. Next up is Ghostface. Now, a little bit of disclaimer. This Ghostface is an original character based on the Scream movies, but it's an original character. So we're not going to base it on the movies. We're going to base it on the information that we have if we read his backstory in the game. Shadowborn certainly seems appropriate. Danny, whatever name you want to refer him as, the Ghostface of DBD is a creature of the night. He absolutely lives a life during the day and then becomes a murderer at night. So more than anyone else, he would be someone that would be accustomed to nighttime because that's when most of his activity took place. Hence Shadowborn. Amalir's is interesting. He definitely has keen senses. It's his own perk. So it obviously suits him. And it does make sense that in the entity, he is absolutely happy because he's one of the killers that absolutely loves to be in the new place he's in and that his senses would be improved. Furtive Chase is also his own perk. So it doesn't need a lot of explaining. As a stalker killer, Danny would, during the day, write about the murders that would happen around the towns, and then during the night commit those murders. And the way he did it was very methodical. He would follow people, figure out their routine, mess with them in various ways, get a sixth sense of enjoyment out of it all, and eventually catch them in one way or another and murder them one by one. And it's this twisted games that he would play that I think make Play With Your Food the final perk. Not only does he become obsessed with one, he's not an efficient cold murder that gets a job done or kills out of necessity. He absolutely took joy in messing with the people he was murdering and gaslighting them in different ways and making them paranoid before finally striking. So hence Play With Your Food is your choice for him. Next up is the Demogorgon. The Demogorgon is basically the main non-human character in here. He was trapped in a laboratory after being summoned through a portal by a bunch of scientists. He eventually escaped. That's why we have some blood and shackles on his character. And as such, he has a different perks than most others. He is a beast of prey. This perk suits him very well. He literally is a beast himself. And because he is not a human with any kind of human emotion or motivation, he is, by definition, probably a lot more unpredictable. Bloodhound also makes sense. Much like a wild animal, he has a sense of smell that even transcends different dimensions, and blood can be tracked across these dimensions. That's one of the reasons why we are repeating the perk Blood Favor. A sacrifice of blood on the normal world can sometimes attract the Demogorgon from his upside down alternative dimension. And Predator I also think is appropriate. Well, these perks could fit several of the killers. None of them are better suitors, I think, than Demogorgon, who literally is a beast of prey, a predator himself. Next up is the Oni. The Oni was basically a samurai brought in a prestigious family who derailed the family tradition. He became obsessed with the purity of the samurai. He was very much a purist, and he strayed from his father's teaching to cleanse the land of fake samurais, as he put it. This made him widely unpopular, and he did not care. He indeed tried to terrorize people, to make examples out of the people he murdered and maimed in all kinds of horrible ways to cause a mass hysteria. He certainly cut people's scalps off. He did all kinds of horrible butcher jobs out of the people he killed to cause panic and dissuade other people that would follow those footsteps. All of that also ties in really well with crowd control for multiple reasons. As someone that perceived themselves to be the true samurai, he looked down upon those that were lesser than him, both in bloodline and in class. So this whole theme from crowd control of being superior fits him really well. It also fits him well considering that he did indeed deal with many crowds. He would cause such controversy, and people would hate him so much that entire groups of warriors would be sent out to deal with him. And one after another, these groups would fall. Kazan, the name of the Oni, was so skilled and so brutal with his tactics that he actually managed to survive several assassination attempts and beat the hell out of groups and groups of warriors by himself. So crowd control, very much appropriate. And then we have the perks Brutal Strength that I think at this point, I mean, look at the guy. Needs almost no explanation. Brutal Strength is a repeated perk that is really appropriate. He was also absolutely brutal in his killings, and Spirit Fury are both appropriate. If you read the Oni's lore, you'll know that he had lost a lot of things. He lost basically his family. He lost the approval of his family, but he was relentless in his pursuit of his self-perceived noble goal. When these things went wrong, he did not take it well. He was sent into fits of absolute rage, part of the Yamaoka tradition, this kind of dragon living in them, this kind of rage that would eventually pass on to Rin, the spirit, many generations afterwards. So Brutal Strength and Spirit Fury, I think, are both appropriate to just show how Kazan would eventually go insane and even die in his pursuit. Next up is the Destlinger. Much like the Hillbilly, we are repeating the perk Nemesis because the Destlinger, my goodness, he had lots of enemies. From being an Irish-American immigrant and being hated by many of the locals due to, you know, good old racism, to having someone betray him multiple times, and yeah. The story of the Destlinger, aka Caleb, is a story of being betrayed and seeking retribution and seeking revenge, and that's eventually what he was taken by the entity for. So Nemesis is very appropriate. The next two perks also make sense. Tinkerer and Hangman Strick. No doubt the Destlinger brought people to be hanged, and he was an ingenious modificator. He was a bit of an engineer of sorts who used his ability to tinker with machines and tinker with self-made contraptions. He put all of that experience to use when he became a bounty hunter, and he made his first weapon the Redeemer, which is the rifle with the spear that you see in his hands right now. Now, the first iteration of this weapon had absolutely no concern for the well-being of the people he was hunting and bringing back to the law. Hence the choice of Sloppy Butcher as the last perk. In fact, his first weapon was notorious for disemboweling and doing horrible things to the bodies of the people that he caught. So he eventually had to change that to be able to keep his prey alive and collect the bounty. And that's pretty much it for the Destlinger. A person who was betrayed, who swore revenge, and who used his mechanical skills to create tools to do so. Next up is the Executioner, also known as Pyramid Head. Now, Pyramid Head isn't an actual real being. It's instead a manifestation of the guilt of James Sunderland, the character protagonist of Silent Hill 2. He is a manifestation of his guilt. James murdered and killed his wife, who was basically in her deathbed, after not being able to deal with the pressure of her terminal disease. And this is a character that just shows up in James to basically torture him and let him come to terms with his own guilt, which he eventually does. Distressing is an absolute great choice. The sheer unnatural geometry and appearance and movements and lack of communication from any way makes this an extremely distressing sight to see when the executioner approaches you. He also makes a noise dragging his sword that would alert anyone around him, and he even gets picked up by the radio that James has that warns him of impending danger. Obviously, seeing him absolutely makes James and other people in the Silent Hill 2 universe freak out. He is a scary presence, unnerving, I think, certainly suits. He also tries to unnerve James and guide him along a path of punishment, which we'll get to. And Iron Maiden also makes a lot of sense. Iron Maiden is a perk with not a lot of description, but it does suggest that you will trap people and you will keep them in a cage, which Pyramid Head does both in-game and in the canonical lore. He also, funnily enough, catches, the first time James meets him, pretty much the first time, is James hiding in a locker. So I think that's also appropriate. And the last perk is Deadlock. Inducing mental suffering, which is the first line of the description of Deadlock, I think is basically the whole gist of Pyramid Head. He wants James to suffer and does horrible things along the way to help steer him into the path of acceptance, which again, eventually he does. And at that point, the executioner serves no purpose and disappears until he gets milked in the sequels. The Blight. The Blight is an alchemist, an extremely ambitious alchemist who can create things out of nothing, or, well, more accurately, change the property of things. I think Pentimento suits him. Pentimento is a perk that takes something broken and gives it a different, new purpose with all kinds of magical abilities. So I think that suits the Blight. It would also this ambition of his eventually took him to dark places and aroused the interest of the entity who took him and made him its servant. Eruption and Thrill and Tremors, I think, are both very appropriate. When I think of an alchemist, explosions, all kinds of weird chemical reactions, I think the word eruption is very natural. It also makes sense that the entity would block things on his behalf when he grabs people, to make sure that he gets where he needs to be. So Eruption comes again from his background, and the perks Thrill and Tremors and Iron Grasp, which we're out repeating a second time, both make sense, because as the entity's mailman of sorts, the Blight canonically messes with many other killers in the universe of Dead by Daylight in the entity's realm. In fact, you'll see that some of his add-ons are actually items and mementos from other killers. So he does kidnap them, Thrill and Tremors, grabbing people, and doesn't let them get away and traps them, Iron Grasp, to experiment with them and inject them with the serum that he developed to grant him magical, incredible powers, which is ultimately what causes him to become the monster that you see him right now, if you haven't read his lore. These are my picks. Next up are the twins, and this is one of the most proud perks I have found for any killer. Discordance, it has actually many definitions. Typically, a discordance is something that happens that disrupts the normal state of things. But another definition of a discordance is when is more of a genetic biology definition that explains when two twin same gene individuals present differences. So discordance not only fits Victor and Charlotte because they are two and they have a bond and they find two survivors on a generator. Not only fits them narratively, it also fits them by definition. So yeah, discordance on twins, absolutely. Franklin's Demise, we are repeating a second time. Many of the items that you see in the add-ons for the twins are little trinkets that Victor or their mom stole. And one of the things that Charlotte had to do when she was on her own was to attack people and forage items and steal. So I think Franklin's Demise is very appropriate. That's basically what the poor twins had to do the whole life to survive. It makes sense that as kids that were experimented on by a dark cult that are surrounded by an air of mysticism that are basically thought to be witches and tried to be executed, the next two perks would come. Hex Ruin, I think, is interesting. Charlotte definitely wishes ill on everyone, on society as a whole, for hating her for how she is. She is a child that was born in France in, I think, the 17th century. And because her brother was a congenital twin, I think, who was absolutely deformed, as you can see, they were persecuted. So it makes sense that she wants to, that she has this energy around her, and she brings ruin to everything around her. And Undying is also appropriate. It's another perk that we are repeating. Now, Victor is one of the only killers to actually die for a long period of time. For years, Victor died in one of the encounters, and then eventually came back with the help of the entity. So that alone, and the fact that Ruin would last even longer, I think makes Undying an appropriate pick. Next up, we go to the Trickster. So the Trickster was a underprivileged boy who eventually found his way, thanks to a shark in the music industry, to stardom. But his view of others, his own view of his own supremacy, and his own narcissism made him do horrible things. The first thing he did was to basically kill, or more appropriately, allow his team of his boy band and his former teammates to die in a fire. He actually had the chance to save his friends from a fire that was going on at the studio, and instead he found it delightful to see them call out his name and ask for help, and he allowed them all to die, and eventually this pushed his career even further, which he was delighted for. Bamboozle, I think, fits that really, really well. He is an agile athlete and dancer, so it makes sense that he would vault windows quicker. The word bamboozle and trick, which is his own name, I think fit really, really well. And also Bamboozle blocks an exit, which I think has thematic implications, obviously, for what we just explained. Lightborn, I think, is also most appropriate on him. Out of any other killer, this man has been on the spotlight and has been covered and showered with light more so than anyone else, so it makes sense that he, more than anyone in the cast, would be completely okay being in complete daylight and under the focus of many, many lights. Starstruck, I think, is also appropriate. Many other killers could maybe have a claim for this, but it's the strongest on him. His position as a celebrity is what allowed him to get away with some of the crimes that he would later do, and these crimes often involved finding fans, some of them obsessed, and taking them to secluded locations where he would torture them. And he would get the same twisted kick out of torturing them than he did when he killed his teammates. And that's where Deadlock, a repeated perk, comes in. So when he kidnapped these people, he didn't just kill them, he actually recorded their sounds, and later, without anyone's noticing, incorporated those sounds into his music by sampling cries of pain and other horrible recordings into his own songs. So I think Deadlock is interesting because he does not tell the people that he's kidnapping that they will get out or that they can get his favor. He literally just straight up tells them that they are going to die, to absolutely crush them, to get the reaction out of them that gives him the most fear-induced sounds that he can possibly record. And that's a Trickster. The Nemesis is a biological weapon developed by a corporation that was sent to a pandemic crazy city of Raccoon City, and he basically has some kind of conditioning and a parasite that you can see manifest through his tentacle that has conditioned him to seek out the Stars members, all of them, and destroy them. And we're going to be talking about the remake and the original Resident Evil for these perks. So this intelligence that arises from the parasite and other experiments and conditioning that Umbrella might have done makes him truly a lethal pursuer. This perk could suit other killers, but I think it's best on Nemesis. He literally is designed to kill. And he does have the awareness of where his prey will be, because throughout the games he knows where to expect. He finds Jill's apartment, He knows to go to the police station. When Jill tries to escape the city in various ways, he always shows up, and he has that intelligence and that awareness and that will to pursue it. Enduring, I think, is an absolute easy perk to explain. You can tell by his stature and his muscles, even in the original, that Nemesis is an absolute monster that feels basically no pain. He doesn't have the emotions of other killers, but he does have this natural imperative to murder his prey. In the game, many weapons are fired at him. Many things happen to him. Depending if you play the remake or the original, he walks through fire. He has a car dropped on top of him, and he does not relent at any point up until the very end. Force penance, I also think, is appropriate both in the remake and in the original. Many characters try to help Jill and help fight Nemesis, and Nemesis has absolutely no problem whatsoever in disposing of these characters. Without trying to spoil much in case you haven't played the games, people that get in the way of him getting to the STARS members, mostly Jill, die very quickly and are disposed of very quickly. So even though Nemesis is not a character that judges, it's not a character that feels emotions in that way, he does quickly judge and suffer harsh and makes them suffer a harsh judgment anytime they get on his way. And then the final perk that I think I really like is Fire Up. Perhaps thanks to his intelligence or conditioning, Nemesis cannot bear the thought of losing his prey. Despite many repeated encounters with Jill, Nemesis never manages to catch her, and in fact goes through a lot of punishment, never once stopping. In fact, becoming stronger and stronger as the story goes on. In the original game, he gets blown up, both in the original game and in the remake. Obviously, he gets shot by a lot of stuff. He gets blown up in a bar by a gas leak. He also gets blown up by a grenade, or in the remake, a plastic explosive that blows up an entire train. He does not relent. He can also get thrown out of a balcony. He can get electrocuted multiple times. In the remake, he gets he's in a building that catches on fire. In the original, he gets thrown into a pool of acid, which also happens in the remakes, and still, despite all of that, he mutates and becomes even stronger, and his resolve to kill Jill lasts until the very end, until he is reduced to a pile of meat. So I think Fire Up is very appropriate. Next up is the Cenobite, and many interesting perks in this one. My favorite one is Make Your Choice. Now the Cenobite has this air of inevitability. He is a hell priest of some kind of alternate dimension where he enforces the will of some messed up creature, and he tortures people and indulges in weird sadomasochistic games of pain and pleasure. And he does seem to convey the idea that he is inevitable and that people that come with him never leave. But that's not what happens in the films. In the films, he's constantly bartering and offering exchanges. We're going to assume it's just the first one, but this also happens in many of the sequels. In the main film, Kirsty Cotton is basically abducted, or is about to be abducted by the Cenobite and his cohort of demons, when she uses the only bargaining tool that she can, which is to offer her uncle, who has been avoiding the Cenobite. And at this point, the Cenobites are persuaded and actually give Kirsty a chance to avoid being captured, and obviously sentenced to all kinds of torture, by giving up her uncle. And as I said, this happens in the films many times, where they will literally allow people to make a choice and to exchange things, which I really like. Gift of Pain, I think, is just a perk that could not belong to anyone else. This is a character that, due to some ritualistic, religious, oddly, depending obviously on how much of the backstory you've read, he is a character that uses the words pain and suffering and pleasure interchangeably. It's some kind of messed up religion of his, if you will. So giving pain and giving sweet pain, I think, is just his own thing. Infectious Freddy is an interesting one. Obviously, as a demon that manifests in the real world through the cube, the lament configuration, he will absolutely scare the soul out of many people, and he does in the films. But what I like about this perk is the first line: "The cries of the unfaithful make your heart leap." And that is true. The Cenobite has a joy that comes out of seeing other people suffer. And that's what I think it makes Infectious really, really appealing. Now, Deathbound is a little bit of a stretch, but I actually like this one. Especially if you've watched many of the sequels, you'll know that the family bloodlines tie some of these bloods together, and the Cenobite likes to enforce that in some twisted ways. In one of the films, I think the 5th one or the 4th one, he literally makes two brothers get fused together and become like a conjoined twins of sort. I personally like it, even though, as I said, maybe Deathbound is a little bit of a stretch and could also work on other killers quite well. And finally, we get to the Artist. Now, the Artist is the one character in the whole killer cast that actually interacts with crows in a more meaningful way in her story. So the common perk Spies from the Shadows, I mean, I just think it makes absolute sense. So that one doesn't need a lot of explanation. The next ones are a little bit more interesting. They are Pain Resonance and Blood Echo. Now, if you read the backstory of the Artist, you'll know that her life is basically just a tragic incident after another tragic incident, being abandoned by their mother, having a stupid, abusive father. Her brother dies. She then becomes an activist, finds a little bit of a niche, and gets caught by the evil dictatorship and gets murdered by some of the agents of the dictatorship. And ultimately, before that, she attempts suicide and gets stopped by the entity, who seems to be guiding her towards a greater goal. So if you put all of that, and then later figure out that she is spreading her own pain and frustration through the entity, the words of Pain Resonance and Blood Echo, I think both make sense. And then the more interesting one is Dragon's Grip. Why is this perk called Dragon's Grip? This perk comes from the Blight, and at one point when the Blight is taken by the entity manifests in one of his streams as a dragon who will just never let him go, who will literally trap him forever. And even though I think this obviously fits the Blight for obvious reasons, I think this fits the Artist arguably even more, because she is, from the very start of her life and her story, in the grip of guilt, in the grip of tragedy, and eventually, before she even knows it, in the grip of the entity. First, she is assaulted by the guilt of losing her mom, then by losing her brother. Then she considers ending her life, but the entity uses the crows to guide her and eventually groom her to be her agent and one of its killers. Yeah, he eventually loses her life, her friends, her fight, and all she has is literally the fact that she is a pawn in someone else's game. So I think Dragon Trip is appropriate for her. And with that, we have ended all of the lower accurate builds. Let me know what you think. I will have this up very, very soon. And I need to go start streaming. So who knows, maybe I'll catch you in one of the live streams. Thanks so much for watching. And check out Pixel Bush Entertainment. I'll be giving a little link. He does videos on lore and goes very much in detail. Some really great content that you should probably check out. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.